The woman had been walking for most of the morning when the Comanche camp finally appeared beyond the low hills. Her boots heavy with dust and her breath tight with fear, yet she did not slow down. Her name was Clara Whitmore, a settler's daughter who had lost almost everything in the past year. Her home burned, her father gone, her younger brother taken during a raid she still saw in her sleep. People along the frontier whispered one name whenever the Comanche were mentioned: the chief known as Ruthless, a man said to rule through silence and fear rather than loud cruelty. Clara had heard those stories too, but desperation had a way of pushing fear aside. The camp was larger than she expected. Rows of teepees standing like quiet watchers under the wide sky, smoke rising gently from cooking fires, horses tied near the edge, their heads lifting as she approached. Warriors noticed her almost at once, their hands resting near their weapons, eyes sharp and unreadable. A white woman walking alone into a Comanche camp was either mad or brave, and no one could tell which she was. Clara stopped a short distance away, lifting her hands to show she carried no weapon, though her heart beat so loudly she felt certain they could hear it. She asked for the chief in a voice that trembled despite her effort to sound calm. The men spoke among themselves in low tones, then one motioned for her to follow. Each step felt heavier than the last as she was led through the camp, past women working, children playing who fell silent as they saw her, and elders who watched with quiet curiosity. Clara kept her head high, reminding herself why she was there. She was not here to beg, not yet. She was here to speak. The chief sat near the largest fire, his posture relaxed but powerful. His presence felt even before she saw his face clearly. He was younger than she expected, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that seemed to weigh everything in a single glance. His expression was calm, almost bored, as if nothing surprised him anymore. This was the man people called Ruthless, the man said to decide life and death with a nod. Clara felt her courage waver, but she stepped forward anyway. Without waiting to be spoken to, she confronted him. She told him who she was, told him about her family, about the raid, about the boy taken from her home. Her words came faster as emotion broke through her control. She accused him of cruelty, of leading men who destroyed lives and vanished into the plains without consequence. Her voice rose despite herself, anger mixing with grief until tears burned her eyes. Around them, the camp grew still, warriors watching closely, some clearly offended, others simply curious to see how the chief would respond. The chief did not move at first. He did not shout. He did not reach for a weapon. When Clara finally paused, breathless and shaking, he lifted one hand slowly. The gesture was small, almost gentle, but it stopped her words as completely as if he had placed a hand over her mouth. The air seemed to tighten. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, carrying authority without effort. He told her to lower her voice, not as an order, but as a simple statement, as if shouting had never been an option worth considering. Clara froze. No one had ever stopped her anger so completely with so little force. The chief looked at her steadily, not with rage, but with something closer to curiosity. He asked her why she believed confrontation would bring her brother back. The question caught her off guard. She had expected threats, dismissal, or death, not a question that forced her to think. She answered honestly, saying she had nothing left to lose, that silence had already taken everything from her. The chief listened without interruption. When she finished, he spoke again, explaining that the world she lived in and the world he ruled followed different laws, neither clean nor fair. He did not deny that his people took what they needed to survive, but he also did not boast of it. He said power did not always need noise, and mercy, when given, was chosen, not demanded. His words were calm, but they carried weight that made Clara's knees feel weak. As the fire crackled between them, Clara realized she had stepped into something far more dangerous and complex than she had imagined. The ruthless chief was not what the stories had painted, and that frightened her more than cruelty would have. When he told her she would stay in the camp for now, not as a prisoner, but not as a guest either, she understood that her confrontation had changed something, though she did not yet know whether it would save her brother or destroy her completely. Clara woke before sunrise, the sounds of the Comanche camp already alive around her, soft footsteps, low voices, the crackle of dying fires, and the distant snort of horses. She lay still on a folded hide near the edge of a teepee, unsure of her place, unsure of what the day would bring. She was not tied, not guarded closely, yet she felt more watched than she ever had behind locked doors. Freedom without certainty felt heavier than chains. An older woman brought her a wooden bowl of warm broth and set it beside her without a word. Clara nodded in thanks, surprised by the small kindness. The woman's eyes were not cruel, only tired, as if she had seen many strangers pass through the camp with fear written on their faces. Clara ate slowly, her thoughts circling the chief's calm voice, the way he had stopped her anger without raising his own. She had expected punishment. Instead, she had been given time, and time felt dangerous. As the sun rose, Clara was allowed to move through parts of the camp, always with quiet eyes following her. Children watched her openly now, curiosity replacing fear. She noticed how the camp worked as one living thing, everyone with a task, everyone moving with purpose. It was not the chaos she had imagined. That truth unsettled her more than any threat would have. If this was the world her brother had been pulled into, then everything she believed needed to be questioned. Near midday, a young warrior approached her. He did not speak her language well, but with gestures he motioned for her to follow. Her heart tightened, but she obeyed. He led her beyond the main fires to a shaded area where several captives sat together, mostly women from different settlements, their faces marked by fear and long waiting. Clara knelt beside them and asked quiet questions. Some had been there weeks, some months. None had been beaten. None had been freed. They existed in a space between hope and despair, much like she did now. One woman whispered that the chief decided everything himself. He was slow to judge, but once his decision was made, it did not change. Another said he listened more than he spoke, and that made him more dangerous than loud men. Clara felt a chill at that thought. She realized her confrontation had not earned her mercy, only attention, and attention could cut both ways. Later that afternoon, the chief summoned her again. This time there was no crowd. They sat across from each other near a small fire, the air heavy with unspoken questions. He asked her about her life before the frontier, about her mother, about what kind of boy her brother was. The questions were precise, almost careful. Clara answered honestly, her voice steady now. She described her brother's kindness, his stubborn hope, his belief that people could choose better even when the world was harsh. The chief listened, his face unreadable. When she finished, he told her that boys taken in raids were not always treated as enemies. Some were taught, some were given new names, new roles. Some grew to belong. Clara felt her chest tighten. The idea that her brother might be alive, changed, perhaps even loyal to this world, frightened her more than death. She asked if he was alive. The chief did not answer directly. He said truth often arrived slowly, and impatience blinded those who rushed it. That night, Clara lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling of the teepee. Anger no longer guided her. Fear no longer ruled her either. In its place grew something sharper, determination shaped by understanding. If she wanted answers, shouting would not bring them. If she wanted her brother, she would have to survive this place, learn it, endure it. She realized that the chief was watching not just her words, but her ability to adapt. As days passed, Clara began to help where she could, carrying water, preparing food, tending small tasks given without praise or punishment. She noticed the chief watching from a distance, never interfering, never encouraging. His silence felt like a test. Each day she expected him to decide her fate. Each night she wondered if the delay was the decision itself. By the end of the second week, Clara understood something deeply unsettling. The ruthless chief did not need cruelty to control others. He allowed people to reveal themselves, then chose accordingly. And as she stood beneath the open sky one evening, she realized that her confrontation had not been the most dangerous moment of her journey. The true danger was that she was beginning to understand him, and understanding might cost her more than fear ever could. Clara had stopped counting the days since she arrived at the Comanche camp, not because time no longer mattered, but because counting made waiting harder. Each morning began the same way, with the sound of movement and quiet voices, with the smell of smoke and horses, with the knowledge that she was still there and her brother was still somewhere beyond her reach. Yet something inside her had shifted. Fear no longer guided her steps. Observation did. She learned quickly that survival in the camp depended on understanding rhythm. When people worked, they worked together. When they rested, they truly rested. No one rushed without reason. Clara noticed how disputes were settled with words or silence rather than force, and how the chief's presence alone could still a rising argument. He rarely appeared close, but when he did, people straightened without being told. Authority here did not shout. One afternoon, Clara was asked to help an injured boy whose foot had been cut on a sharp stone. She knelt beside him, cleaning the wound with careful hands, remembering how her mother once treated neighbors back home. The boy watched her closely, suspicion fading into curiosity. When she finished, he smiled shyly and said a word she did not understand, but the meaning was clear. Gratitude. That small moment stayed with her longer than any threat had. Later that day, the chief called for her again. This time, he did not ask questions. Instead, he told her to walk with him. They moved away from the camp, toward a low ridge where the land stretched wide and open. Clara followed silently, her thoughts racing. When they stopped, the chief looked out across the plains and spoke quietly. He said land remembered everything: footsteps, blood, promises broken and kept. He said people often believed they owned land, but in truth, land decided who could stay. Clara listened, unsure of how to respond. Then he told her that survival demanded balance, between strength and restraint, between memory and forgetting. He said those who clung only to anger were easy to control, but those who learned patience could endure anything. Clara realized he was speaking as much about her as about himself. The thought unsettled her. She asked again about her brother. The chief looked at her for a long moment, then said the boy lived. The words hit her like a sudden wind. Relief flooded her chest, followed quickly by fear. Alive meant changed. Alive meant choices had been made without her. The chief said the boy was being taught, not punished. He said the boy was strong in spirit, stubborn, and quick to learn. Clara felt pride and sorrow twist together inside her. That night, Clara cried quietly into her blanket, careful not to be heard. She mourned the brother she remembered and feared the man he might become. She wondered whether bringing him back would tear him apart, or whether leaving him would break her forever. The question had no answer yet. The next days brought new challenges. Some warriors viewed her growing presence with suspicion. A few resented the attention the chief gave her, even if it was distant and cold. Clara felt the shift in the air, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the way eyes lingered longer than before. She understood now that survival was not only about the chief's judgment, but the camp's acceptance. When a sudden storm struck, tearing through the camp with violent wind and rain, Clara did not hide. She helped secure shelters, held down loose hides, guided frightened children to safety. She slipped in the mud and scraped her hands raw, but she did not stop. People noticed. Not praise, not smiles, but acknowledgement, and in this place that meant something. After the storm passed, the chief approached her once more. He said nothing at first. Then he told her that courage shown without demand carried weight. He said the camp watched her, not as an enemy, but not as one of them either. He warned her that standing between worlds often meant belonging to neither. As Clara stood under the clearing sky, exhausted and aching, she understood the truth of his words. Each step she took toward understanding this world pulled her farther from the life she once knew. Yet turning back now would mean abandoning her brother and everything she had learned. The cost of learning was becoming clear, and it was higher than she had ever imagined. The morning after the storm felt heavier than the days before it. The air was clean, the sky wide and pale, yet tension lay over the camp like an unseen weight. Clara sensed it as she moved through the familiar paths, carrying water, helping where she was asked, careful not to draw attention. People no longer watched her with simple curiosity. Now there was judgment in their eyes, quiet and measured, as if the camp itself was deciding what to do with her. She learned the reason before midday. 2 warriors had returned from a scouting ride with news that unsettled everyone. Settlers were moving closer, building new fences along a river the Comanche had relied on for generations. The land that remembered everything, as the chief had said, was being claimed by lines drawn in anger and fear. Murmurs spread through the camp, frustration growing sharper with every word. Clara felt the shift immediately. To some, she was no longer just a woman searching for her brother. She was a symbol of the people pushing inward. That afternoon, voices rose near the council fire. Clara kept her distance, but the sound of argument carried far. Some demanded action, a strike to remind settlers of the cost of trespass. Others urged caution, warning that violence would bring soldiers and suffering. Clara realized with a cold twist in her stomach that her presence in the camp now carried risk. If blood was spilled, she could become the excuse or the warning. The chief remained silent through most of the debate. When he finally spoke, the camp fell still. His voice was calm, but firm. He said haste destroyed what patience could protect. He said the land was not defended by rage alone, but by choosing battles wisely. Not everyone agreed, and Clara saw it in the tight jaws and narrowed eyes of certain warriors. Silence followed his words, but it was not peace. That evening, the chief called Clara to him privately. He told her plainly that she stood between 2 fires. If conflict came, neither side would fully trust her. He warned her that some would see harm to her as justice, others as protection. He asked her if she understood what it meant to remain. Clara answered without hesitation. She said she would stay. Leaving without her brother was not an option. The chief studied her, then nodded once, as if confirming something he had already known. The days that followed were restless. Clara sensed anger simmering beneath daily routines. She noticed how warriors sharpened weapons more often, how horses were kept closer at night. She also noticed the quiet acts of restraint, elders speaking softly to the young, women urging patience. The camp was balanced on a blade, and Clara felt every step she took could tip it. One afternoon, a young warrior confronted her near the river. His words were sharp, accusing her people of stealing land and lives. Clara did not argue. She listened. When he finished, she told him her family had lost land too, lost safety, lost blood to the same hunger for more. She said suffering did not choose sides. The warrior looked at her for a long moment, anger fading into something more complicated, then walked away without another word. That night, Clara was finally taken to see her brother from a distance. She watched him across the camp, older than she remembered, his posture straighter, his movements confident. He laughed with other boys, his hair cut differently, his clothing foreign. For a moment, relief filled her. He was alive. Then grief followed close behind. He belonged here in ways she did not. The chief stood beside her, silent. Clara asked if her brother wanted to leave. The chief said that question was not his to answer. He said forcing a choice too soon could break what was still forming. Clara clenched her hands, torn between hope and fear. She realized that saving her brother might mean trusting him to choose, even if that choice led away from her. As the moon rose, casting silver light over the restless camp, Clara understood her position clearly. She was no longer only a seeker. She was a witness, a bridge, and a risk. Standing between 2 fires meant learning how not to burn. And as the camp prepared for whatever the future would bring, Clara knew that her next choices would shape not only her fate, but the fate of those she loved on both sides of the line. The days after Clara saw her brother from a distance passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Knowing he was alive should have brought her peace, but instead it filled her with questions that refused to rest. She watched him whenever she could, careful not to be seen, studying the way he moved, the way he listened, the way he laughed. He was no longer the frightened boy she remembered. He stood taller now, his shoulders stronger, his eyes sharper. The realization hurt more than she expected. Clara struggled with her own place in the camp. Some people spoke to her more openly now, offering small kindnesses without suspicion. Others avoided her entirely. She felt the divide growing, Not loud, not violent, but quiet and firm, like a line drawn in dry earth. She understood that trust here was not given through words, but through time and action. And time, she feared, was not on her side. One morning, an elder woman asked Clara to help gather roots beyond the camp. It was the first time she had been allowed to leave the immediate area without a watcher. Clara agreed at once, sensing this was another test. They walked together in silence for a while, the wind moving softly through the grass. At last, the elder spoke. She told Clara that life was shaped by choices made when no one was watching. She said pain followed everyone, but wisdom belonged to those who chose carefully what pain to carry. Clara listened, realizing the words were meant for her. She asked how to know which choice was right. The elder smiled faintly and said there was no such thing as a painless choice, only honest ones. That answer stayed with Clara long after they returned to camp. Later that day, the chief summoned her once more. This time his tone was different, less distant, more direct. He told her that her presence had reached a turning point. Her brother was old enough now to begin training as a warrior, a path that would bind him deeply to the tribe. Once that path began, leaving would become far more difficult. The chief said this without threat, without judgment. He said it as fact. Clara felt her breath catch. She asked what would happen if she tried to take her brother away by force. The chief met her gaze steadily and said she would fail, and her brother would suffer for it. The honesty in his voice frightened her more than anger would have. He then said something unexpected. He said the boy should be allowed to choose, but not yet. He needed time to understand both worlds before deciding between them. That night, Clara slept little. She weighed every memory, every promise she had ever made. She thought of her father, of the life they had lost, of the future she had imagined for her brother. She also thought of the camp, the structure, the belonging she saw forming around him. For the first time, she questioned whether bringing him back truly meant saving him. The following days tested her resolve. Rumors spread of settlers moving again, closer than before. Tension returned to the camp, sharper now. Some warriors openly blamed Clara's people. Others defended the chief's patience. Clara felt the weight of being watched again, not as a stranger, but as a possible spark. One evening, her brother noticed her at last. Their eyes met across the firelight. Recognition flickered, followed by confusion, then something like longing. He did not approach her. He did not run away. He simply watched. That quiet moment struck Clara harder than any reunion could have. She realized he was standing on the same edge she was, between memory and change. The next morning, Clara made a choice of her own. She went to the chief and told him she would not rush her brother. She said she would stay, observe, and wait, even though waiting hurt. The chief nodded slowly. He said patience was not weakness, but strength shaped over time. As Clara walked away, the camp stirred around her, alive and uncertain. She knew the road ahead would demand more from her than courage alone. It would demand sacrifice. And though she did not yet know how her story would end, she understood one truth clearly now. The greatest battles were not fought with weapons, but with the weight of choices that could never be undone. Clara sensed the change before anyone spoke of it. The camp no longer moved with quiet patience. Conversations ended abruptly when strangers passed. Scouts returned more often, their faces tight, their reports short. The land beyond the hills was no longer calm. The settlers were closer now, closer than they had ever been, and fear pressed against the camp like an approaching storm. One evening, a council was called. Fires were lit, and voices rose again, sharper than before. This time, patience struggled to hold its ground. News had come that a settler outpost had begun building near a sacred crossing. To many, this was no longer a question of waiting but of survival. Clara stayed at the edge, listening, understanding that her presence mattered even when she was not speaking. The chief listened as always, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, he said a message would be sent first, a warning, not an attack. He said blood once spilled was difficult to stop. Some warriors accepted this. Others did not. Clara felt the tension split the camp, a thin crack that widened with every breath. That night, Clara overheard hushed voices near the horses. She recognized the tone immediately, anger sharpened by impatience. A small group of young warriors planned to ride out before dawn, to strike the settlers and force a response. Clara's heart raced. If they acted, violence would follow, and everything the chief had worked to prevent would collapse. She faced a terrible choice. If she stayed silent, blood would be spilled. If she spoke, she might be seen as a traitor interfering in matters that were not hers. She thought of her brother, of the fragile balance she had helped build, of the camp standing on the edge of destruction. Silence, she realized, was no longer neutral. Before dawn, Clara sought out the chief. She told him what she had heard, her voice steady despite the fear burning in her chest. The chief did not show surprise. He thanked her quietly and said he would handle it. She asked if this meant punishment. He replied that understanding came before punishment, and that rash actions often grew from unheard fears. When the sun rose, the young warriors were summoned. The chief spoke to them alone. No shouting carried across the camp, no display of force. Yet when the men emerged, their eyes were lowered, their anger dimmed. Whatever the chief had said, it had reached them more deeply than threats ever could. The camp breathed again, but the danger had not passed. Scouts returned with troubling news. Settlers had spotted riders near their outpost and were calling for soldiers. Even a warning could now be mistaken for attack. Clara understood that events had moved beyond careful control. The world outside did not listen the way this camp did. That evening, the chief approached Clara as she worked near the fire. He told her she had acted with courage, but courage always carried cost. Word of her warning would spread. Some would respect it, others would never forgive it. He asked her if she was prepared to bear that weight. Clara answered honestly. She said she was tired of fear deciding for her. Later that night, Clara spoke with her brother for the first time. He approached her quietly, curiosity in his eyes. He asked why she had come. Clara told him the truth about their family, about her search, about the choices she had made. She did not tell him what to do. She simply told him she wanted him safe. He listened silently, then said he did not yet know where he belonged. As they parted, Clara felt both hope and sorrow. His uncertainty mirrored her own. She realized that protecting him might mean allowing him to stand in uncertainty longer than either of them wanted. The next morning, the chief announced that a delegation would ride to meet the settlers, to speak before soldiers arrived. It was a risk, but a necessary one. Clara watched as preparations began, knowing that words would soon face weapons, and patience would be tested against fear. As the camp stirred with uneasy purpose, Clara understood that silence had broken, and there was no returning to the calm that once existed. Choices made in quiet now echoed loudly across the land. And as she stood between worlds once more, she knew that whatever came next would reshape not only her fate, but the fragile future of everyone she had come to care for. The morning the delegation prepared to ride out, the camp felt unusually still. Even the children sensed the weight of the day and kept close to their families. Horses were saddled carefully, weapons checked but not raised. This was not a war party. It was something more dangerous. It was a meeting where words would be tested against fear, and fear often spoke louder. Clara stood near the edge of the camp, watching the preparations with a tight chest. She knew this meeting could end in understanding or in blood, and there would be little space between the two. The chief moved among his people with quiet assurance, speaking to each rider, placing a hand on a shoulder, offering no speeches, only presence. That calm steadied the camp more than any promise could have. Before they left, the chief approached Clara. He told her she would come with them. The words surprised her. She asked why. He said the settlers would listen differently if they saw her, a woman of their own world standing beside him by choice. He warned her that this placed her in danger, not from the Comanche, but from her own people. Clara accepted without hesitation. She understood that being seen was now part of the price she had chosen to pay. The ride to the river crossing was slow and deliberate. Dust rose behind them as the sun climbed higher. Clara felt every mile stretch between the life she had known and the uncertain path ahead. When they reached the clearing near the settlers' outpost, she saw men waiting, rifles held low but ready, suspicion written across their faces. Fear lived there too, sharp and restless. The chief dismounted first, unarmed. Clara followed, her hands visible, her heart pounding. The settlers murmured among themselves, startled by her presence. One man stepped forward, demanding to know why she stood with them. Clara spoke before fear could silence her. She told them there was no raid planned, no attack, only a warning meant to prevent bloodshed. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. The chief then spoke, his tone calm, measured. He said the land they were building on fed his people long before fences existed. He said pushing farther would force choices no one wanted. He did not threaten. He did not plead. He stated truths plainly and allowed silence to do the rest. Clara watched the settlers struggle with his composure, with the realization that rage was not waiting behind his words. The tension stretched painfully. One settler accused the Comanche of past violence. Another spoke of families to protect. Clara realized both sides carried grief, carried fear, carried stories that justified their anger. She stepped forward again, her voice steadier now. She said violence would not bring safety, only graves. She said both sides stood to lose everything. A long pause followed. Finally, an older settler lowered his rifle. He said soldiers were already on the way, called by rumors and fear. The chief acknowledged this with a nod. He said soldiers would come whether invited or not, but choices made today would shape what followed. He proposed a temporary boundary, a pause, a chance to speak again before blood was spilled. The settlers withdrew to confer. Clara stood between the two sides, feeling the weight of every gaze. She knew some would remember her face with gratitude, others with hatred. When the settlers returned, they agreed to halt construction for a short time. It was not peace. It was not victory. But it was a line not crossed, at least for now. The ride back to camp was quiet, relief mixed with exhaustion. When they arrived, the camp listened as the chief spoke briefly of what had been achieved. No cheers followed, only nods, quiet acceptance, and the understanding that the future remained uncertain. That night, Clara stood alone under the stars. She realized she had crossed a line she could never step back over. She had spoken for both worlds and belonged fully to neither. Yet she felt no regret. She had chosen action over silence, understanding over fear. As the firelight flickered across the camp, Clara knew the final choice still waited ahead. For her brother, and for a future balanced on the thin line she had helped hold, even if only for a moment. The days after the meeting passed with an uneasy calm, the kind that followed near disaster rather than true peace. The camp moved forward, but cautiously, as if every step might reopen wounds not yet healed. Clara felt the change in small ways, fewer whispers when she passed, more thoughtful glances, less suspicion but no comfort either. She had become known now, not just as a stranger, but as someone who had spoken when silence would have been safer. The chief kept his distance again, returning to the quiet watchfulness that defined him. Yet Clara sensed his attention never truly left her. Decisions had been delayed, not erased, and everyone knew time was only being borrowed. Scouts still rode out. Elders still spoke in low voices at night. The future remained fragile. Clara spent more time near her brother, never forcing conversation, never pulling him aside. She worked where he could see her, laughed softly when children played nearby, showed him who she was now rather than who she had been. Slowly, he began to approach her on his own, asking small questions about their past, about their mother's voice, about the river they once fished near their home. Clara answered gently, careful not to pull him backward or push him forward. One evening, as the sky burned red with sunset, her brother finally spoke the question she had been dreading. He asked where he belonged. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had both endured. Clara did not answer right away. She remembered the elder's words about honest choices and pain. She told him the truth, that belonging was not given by blood alone or taken by force. It was chosen, and every choice carried loss. She told him she would take him home if he wished, even if the journey was dangerous, even if the world beyond the camp was harsh and uncertain. She also told him she would not pull him away if his heart stayed here. Her voice broke, but she did not hide it. Honesty mattered more now than strength. Her brother listened quietly, then said he was not ready to choose yet. He said he had learned things here, discipline, purpose, and a sense of place, but he had not forgotten where he came from. He asked if waiting was allowed. Clara smiled through tears and said waiting was sometimes the bravest choice of all. The following morning, the chief called Clara to him one last time. They stood apart from the camp, the plains stretching endlessly before them. He told her the settlers had agreed to speak again, that soldiers had been delayed, not dismissed. The balance she had helped create still held, but only just. He said her presence had shifted the path of events, not by force, but by choice. He then offered her a decision. She could leave now, escorted safely beyond Comanche lands, or she could remain longer, not as a captive, not as a guest, but as someone who had earned time. He warned her that staying meant uncertainty and risk. Leaving meant peace mixed with regret. Clara thought of her brother, of the camp, of the road behind her and the unknown ahead. She realized she no longer measured safety the way she once had. She chose to stay, not forever, not blindly, but long enough to let her brother's choice become clear. The chief nodded, accepting her answer without comment. As seasons began to shift, Clara understood what remained after fire was not always ash. Sometimes it was clarity. The camp had not become gentle. The world beyond had not become fair. But lines had been drawn without blood. Choices had been made without violence. And understanding had taken root where fear once ruled. One morning, her brother told her he would leave with her when the next safe passage came. Not because he rejected this world, but because he wanted to carry its lessons into another. Clara embraced him, knowing the road ahead would be hard, knowing nothing would ever be simple again. As Clara prepared for the journey, she looked back at the camp one last time, at the chief standing quietly among his people, at the land that remembered everything. She understood now that ruthless did not always mean cruel, that silence could hold power, and that courage was often found not in confrontation, but in choosing what remained when the fire had passed.